This episode is brought to you by Anachronistic Scriveners. As any true author will tell you, you can't generate great works of literature on a cold, sterile word processing application. No, that silent tapping on a laptop keyboard will only reward you with the pale yellowing face from hours spent in front of the monitor's bluish, sleep-sucking light. If you want the muses Calliope and Erato to speak through your laboring fingers, you need a writing tool that beats each letter into the paper, like it's trying to bruise the words onto the parchment. Anachronistic Scriveners has bought the patent rights to all your favorite typewriter brands from the 1930s and 40s. Royal, Underwood, Smith Corona. Think how smart you'll feel carrying around these marvelous classic tools of the humanities in a 40-pound suitcase. They also offer the overly complicated models, like the 1906 Oliver, that lets you feel like you're staring into the maw of the creature from the movie Predator as you create your magnum opus, and gives your manuscript the sense that it's running through a gauntlet of steel paddles. Art is born of suffering, and you'll never create the great novel of your generation unless your fingers ache from forcing each key down with the commitment of a fist blow to the face. And when you're done, you can enjoy a satisfying, unfiltered cigarette, just like the great writers. And when you're ready to step up to the next level of authorial eloquence, order their Gutenberg press. Nothing brings your characters to life like placing each letter by hand, backwards and upside down. And thank you, Anachronistic Scriveners, for sponsoring the Rereading Wolf podcast. This episode is brought to you by the support of generous listeners just like you. You can learn how to be one of them at patreon.com/rereadingwolf. And thank you, listener patrons, for supporting the Rereading Wolf podcast.
Warning. The following discussion is deliberately riddled with spoilers and unhinged speculation on this nearly 40-year-old book, Gene Wolfe's The Book of the New Sun. You can't read a Gene Wolfe story. You can only reread a Gene Wolfe story.
Welcome to Rereading Wolf. We don't pretend that this is the first time you and we have read these books. We want to understand them in as much detail as possible, and that means considering the works as a whole.
Hi, I'm James Wynn.
And I'm Craig Brewer. It's been a little while since we've had an author interview, so I'm happy to introduce Darrell Schweitzer. I think most people listening to this will know his name because his book, Mask of the Sorcerer, is one of the novels that's often called wolf-like, alongside Swanwick's Stations of the Tides and Lafferty and Crowley. But he's also important to genre overall because of his work as an interviewer, reviewer, critic, and bibliographer. Personally, I've found his book on Lord Dunsany, Pathways to Elfland, to be essential, especially since it's one of the few places you can learn about the man's work over his whole life and not just those famous short stories from his early career. And he and S.T. Joshi are two of the people most responsible for finding a lot, if not most or all, of Dunsany's uncollected stories and plays and making them available. He's also written on Lovecraft and Robert Howard. He's worked as an editor on Asimov's Amazing Stories and was the editor of Weird Tales for a while. But for wolf folk, I think the reason he comes up a lot is that he straddles a lot of genre lines, making fantasy and sci-fi weird in all kinds of wonderful ways. Also, a couple years ago, PS Press put out a 2-volume retrospective of his short stories. The first volume called Mysteries of the Faceless King and the second called The Last Heretic. I know I at least mentioned on Facebook when I got them, trying to get other people to do it too, but they are wonderful, wonderful reading. So I have a bad habit that probably drives James crazy when we talk to people. When I'm supposed to be interviewing, I just kind of jump in and start chatting and totally forget to do a formal opening. And since I was flying solo on this one, James wasn't there to keep me in line. So here's Darrell Schweitzer. And links to any and everything we mention are in the show notes for this episode. Yeah, well, thanks for doing this. I really appreciate it. I've read your stuff for a long time and I've always thought you were just a wonderful, wonderful writer. So starting this podcast has always been an excuse for us to just talk to other writers we like, whether they have a strong connection to Wolf or not. It's just something that is a fun thing.
Well, don't keep these secrets.
No, I tell people all the time. Absolutely. No, I've gotten more people to read, Mask of the Sorcerer and I single-handedly, I know I did get 2 other people to buy that Mysteries of the Faceless King the duo. So
From the duo, yeah.
Yep. So, those are a couple beautiful little books. But I've been fascinated. Honestly, I'll admit, I stumbled onto you originally, even though I'm sure I had seen your name, because even back when I was a kid, I was, reading Asimov's and analog and fantasy and sci-fi and everything. So I'm sure your name was already familiar, but then
probably, well, from those, maybe you saw my name in Amazing and Fantastic, particularly in the Eleanor Maver period. Yeah, about 1980.
Yeah. So then, but I really paid attention after I read your book on Dunsany, and it is Dunsany, right? Is that how we're?
Yes, rhymes with rainy.
That's what I thought. I've told people that before, and I think it was you on a interview or a YouTube thing somewhere, and you corrected it. I'm like, okay, it must be.
I have this on the best authority.
from the family itself, right?
Well, from Sprague de Camp, who has it from the family itself. Well, I also did meet Joe Doyle, who is sort of the manager of the estate, and he didn't correct me.
There you go. Well, good. Well, yeah, I've told people that, and they don't believe me.
Sprague met Lady Dunsany, the writer's wife, and his son. He did not meet Lord Dunsany. Yeah. But and as the people used to say, Sprague liked to pronounce words, so he was always very precise about this.
Very cool. Very cool. But yeah, so I read your book, and that kind of led me into some of your interviews and your nonfiction. Then I circled back to a lot of the fiction.
Yes. There are 3 volumes of miscellaneous essays, and there should be, I'm due for another one.
Oh, I'd love it.
In my copious spare time. Well, right now I seem to be so busy compiling stuff that I'm not producing as much. I'm compiling two books of interviews.
Oh, wow. That's great.
Previously uncollected, including there will be a Gene Wolfe interview in there.
Oh, wonderful.
But it was the early one, the one I did in 1983.
That's great.
Basically, I found a fan who can help me with the scanning. And so what we're doing is we're doing all of the interviews of mine that have never been reprinted.
Oh, that's great.
There are quite a few of them fell through the cracks between the Borgo Press series and the Wildside Press series, and particularly the ones that predated my owning a computer.
Yeah, I can see that. Who else is in there?
There's a James Morrow. There's Fred Saberhagen, C.J. Cherry, back when she was a new writer. John Varley, back when he was a new writer.
Oh, wow.
I mean, we are talking about interviews that are as old as 1976. And there's a Michael Moorcock from the 70s.
See, that's the thing. From the ones from the older period, that would catch a lot of people's attention. I
pointed out, it's sort of like if you got to interview Homer right after he's done with the Iliad and he's thinking about a sequel.
Oh, yeah.
This is not reportage. It's somewhere between archaeology and oral history.
Yeah.
You want to know what he was thinking then. And, there's a very good long interview with Tom Dish in there.
Oh, that's
particularly pleased to get that one reprinted. And there are actually more of them than I realized even existed.
That's great.
Yeah. So they're going to be 2 of those, and I'm doing a Best of Weird Tales anthology series for Centipede Press. Are you familiar with Centipede Press books?
Yeah.
The big black things the size of suitcases?
Yep.
Well, 3 volumes, one for the 20s, one for the 30s, one's for the 40s and 50s. Of course, no one will be able to afford them. Well, even I wouldn't be able to afford them if I weren't afford them.
Oh, yeah. No, I know what you mean.
They're enormous. The 20s volume is in proof and should be out soon. There should be another anthology out from PS Publishing soon called Shadows Out of Time. It is my ambition to one day become so famous that I can do an anthology that isn't about Lovecraft. And Hippocampus Press is going to do another volume of my Lovecraftian fiction. If you're familiar with Awaiting Strange Gods, it's sort of a sequel to that.
Oh, great.
And Priya Press in Australia, Danny Lovecraft's outfit, is doing a book of my poetry.
Oh, that's fun.
Not the silly stuff, but the real stuff. The 3rd such volume to exist. And then, just to make life interesting, John Betancourt has asked me to help him continue he did a Best of Weird Tales 1923. So we're going to at least go as far as the public domain extends. So we can do 24, 25, and 26 right now. Wait another year and you can do 27. And so right now I'm reading all of 1924 Weird Tales much more closely than I did before.
Are there surprises, or is there a lot of it that's awful?
A lot of it's really awful. It's a very bad year for Weird Tales. That was the year they went bankrupt and reorganized. So there is, it's January, February, March, April. Then there's a May, June, July anniversary issue, and then November and December, which are the first two Farnsworth Wright issues, and they're somewhat better. We couldn't candidly call it the least bad of Weird Tales 1924. The 1924, 25, 26 volumes will be Wildside Press cheap paperbacks. The ones by the decade with incredible amounts of artwork and every conceivable bell and whistle you can imagine, those will be Centipede Press.
Gotcha.
Oh, I'll tell you one of the great perks of having done all these interviews over the years is that Centipede Press frequently reprints them in their volumes.
And do you get a cut for that?
Yeah, I get not only do they pay me for it, but I get copies of the books which I could otherwise never afford.
Which may be worth more than what they're paying you sometimes.
Yeah, I'm in their aisle. For example, I'm in their edition of Silverberg's Dying Inside that's coming out soon.
Gotcha. Very cool.
And such things as their edition of Evangeline Walton's Witch House and quite a few others.
Wow.
Yeah, I built up a collection of very expensive doorstops.
That's awesome. Can I ask a crass question, I guess, or not too crass? I mean, but do you get paid for the interviews with the magazines? Like when you were doing these originally, you would?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. In fact, you would get usually the same rate you would get for anything else from a magazine. And then sometimes you could sell them abroad. They were, in fact, I could ride my own coattails wonderfully with these. It got me into a lot of places where I otherwise wouldn't have gotten with fiction immediately. And then I started getting, particularly after I did an interview with Isaac Asimov, I started getting all these queries from foreign magazines. Yeah. And I made a bunch of foreign connections. And so I had lots of interviews being published in Dutch and Italian and German. And then I would ask those guys, hey, would you like to see a story? And so the result is the first time my name was ever on the cover of a magazine for a piece of fiction was in Dutch. About 1979. And it said Frederick Pohl, H.G. Wells, Darrell Schweitzer. and that I was not equal to the other two. I wasn't going to disillusion them. There was a time when I could fly to a convention, do a handful of interviews, and pay for the entire trip.
That's great.
It was great. I remember when I went to the World Fantasy Con in Seattle in about 1989, I came back with a long interview with Ursula Le Guin, another one with Marianne Zimmer Bradley, and another one with Dan Simmons. And that paid for the entire trip. Airfare, hotel, everything.
And now the next question is, did you share any of that cut with the subject of the interview? Or
no, you do. The customarily one doesn't.
Yeah, I was wondering.
The custom of the trade, at least the custom of the trade as I've established it, since I've done probably more interviews than anybody else, is that the interview is the literary property of the interviewer. Mm-hmm. But the interviewee has a sort of blanket lease from me to use it.
Okay.
So, like, for example, you'll find in the Julian May's The Pliocene Companion, there's an interview with Julian May by me. All I asked you to do is send me a copy.
Yeah. Or
more recently, in one of Chip Delaney's nonfiction books, there was an interview with me from 1975, and I didn't require anybody to pay me. Yeah. I just said send me a copy, and meanwhile, I'm going to use that interview in my book too.
I mean, that's smart. If you can get into, and it's a way to get to the top of the slush pile, if nothing else. I mean,
it is.
They know who you are.
Harlan Ellison used to insist on being paid to be interviewed.
That fits with the character. Yeah.
Yeah, and this is probably one of the reasons why I never interviewed him. And then there are some people who are just too famous to interview.
Sure.
Well, like for example, I once asked Frank Herbert, and he said no.
That's a shame.
I'm glad I got to Neil Gaiman before he was too famous. Interesting enough, when I interviewed Gaiman, we didn't talk about comics. Mm-hmm. I didn't actually know much about Sandman at the time. We ended up talking about Lafferty and Wolfe and writing and so on, and Hope Mirrlees. He's very big on Hope Mirrlees. Maybe we should get on to our topic.
Yeah, that's fine. No, this is like I said, this is an excuse to to pick your brain about other things and find out what you're doing. So,
well, go ahead. I have something in there.
Well, good. Well, let's talk about, you're talking about interviews, so about your interview with Wolfe. Maybe that's a good place to start. How did you line up to get him? Did he want to?
Oh, he was very accessible.
Or when was it? I forget.
Well, the better known interview with Wolfe, the one that's in, speaking of the Fantastic Two, and was published in the first terminus issue of Weird Tales, must have been done, considering that Weird Tales was published about, we had it for the World Fantasy Con in 1987, which would have been, around Halloween of 1987. Mm-hmm. So, but most of my interviews are done at conventions, and I cannot remember necessarily which one, unless I say so at the end. The interview must have been done in 1987.
Okay.
Or maybe late 86. Wolfe, most writers are very approachable. You just ask them to find some time, sit down with them at a convention. Most of these interviews are done at conventions. Mm-hmm. So there's really nothing unusual about the circumstances,
Yeah.
I didn't interview him while we were both climbing Mount Everest or something. And he was very approachable and very accessible. I have a pretty good record for that. I'm one of the few people who ever interviewed R.A. Lafferty. I got him sober. Anyway, and I did another interview with Wolfe that was published in Fantasy Review around 1982 or 1983. It's going to take some excavation in my garage to find my run of Fantasy Review and find that interview. I don't remember what it was about, but the other one, which I just glanced through before we did this, was you could also tell. You can date it pretty precisely, because the Book of the New Sun has come out, and we're talking about that. And the Earth of the New Sun has not come out yet, but it's done.
Gotcha.
And so you can date it very precisely that way. And so we were largely talking about the New Sun books, and we were talking about the first two Latro books.
Well, that's an interesting time too, because I know, at least so the story goes, is that Earth of the New Sun came about because David Hartwell wanted him to do something of a kind of explanation or coda. Yeah. And then it turned into Earth of the New Sun. So people always wonder whether was really Wolfe's desire to write that book or not.
Well, I think and then of course you have the entire Long Sun, so they just keep going. Well, remember he said that he originally said that the entire Book of the New Sun was intended to be a novella for Orbit. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And things, and he also said that that they would have been even longer if he hadn't gone through to take things out. The editorial process for him was to go through the 4 volumes of the Book of the New Sun and take stuff out, which is probably just as well. If something like that becomes overburdened with too much detail, you can lose the main thread.
Right.
And well, we all know Gene was a consummate craftsman, so and a good deal of the craft of writing is knowing what to leave out. And so he was very good at that.
I've often wondered if he wrote his stories sort of explaining everything, and then part of the Wolfe magic is going in and taking out just enough to
all the
make a wonderful mood and a wonderful set of questions.
Well, this raises a serious issue of why Gene Wolfe will never be a bestseller, and he won't. And I think we all know that.
Yeah. And
the reason is that for many readers, his books are very difficult. I was in a book discussion, and I put them up to this. A Philadelphia Science Fiction Society book discussion did Gene Wolfe's piece. No one understood it. Most of them did not realize it was a ghost story. Mm-hmm. Didn't think it had any fantastic content at all. Even though there is a bit in there in piece where somebody from the future, basically, somebody projects his voice into his childhood self. What I think happened was the protagonist who was in his 60s before he is dead projected his voice, his 60-year-old voice, into his childhood self. So odd things do happen in that book.
Oh yeah.
But most people don't understand it, and I can also tell you that the deep dark secret I know as a bookseller, which is one of my other bad habits, is that aside from the Book of the New Sun, Wolfe doesn't really sell. He's a writer like Lafferty or Avram Davidson who appeals to, well, we'll say an elite. We'll admit it. virtually all readers are elites anyway. I mean, if you think about it, if we have a population of 350 million and a book is success, and a book like that might sell 10,000 copies in hardcover, and that's a success.
Right.
What percentage of the population are we reaching? So we're all a bunch of mandarins writing, fine pens for other mandarins, and let's just admit it.
But no, you're right. And we see stuff on Twitter all the time of people saying, I've read sci-fi my whole life, but I've never quite cracked a Gene Wolfe novel. So yeah, once you start getting fractions of the population, part of the sci-fi group, and then there's the part who wouldn't want to read Wolfe.
Well, maybe the Lord of the Rings is mass culture, but I think it's mostly because of the movies.
Yeah. Before the movies, it was definitely.
It was still something you had to actually have read books. What a concept. And so we're unashamedly elitist in that we write for people who read, and then we write for kind of specialized people who read.
And then he is something of an acquired taste, because a lot of the times when you're reading, you're, like you said, you're not going to necessarily know exactly what's happening.
Some people argue that his books are designed to be reread.
That is the name of our show, is Rereading Wolfe.
Okay. Well, he's a writer like David Lindsay, the author of A Voyage to Arcturus. So that every year from now till the end of time, somebody's going to read these books and be absolutely thrilled. Not a lot of people, but somebody will. And he will. The reason he probably won't ever be forgotten is precisely because he is unique, and he basically, because you can't replace him with somebody else in the next generation.
Yeah.
If you want Wolfe, you got to read Wolfe. There is no substitute. This is why. Frankly, this you see this in literature a lot. This is why all the Tolkien imitations are going to fade, because they can be replaced by other Tolkien imitations. And all the Robert E. Howard imitations are going to fade. Already have. You remember those?
Oh yeah, Robert Jordan stuff.
I'm thinking about John Jakes and Lynn Carter.
Oh, yep.
Well, what we used to call fur jockstrap books.
The gore novels that I used to see all over.
They're not. I wouldn't blame Howard on those. They're a specialized. They're a specialized perversion. They have their own appeal, let us say, and but basically, if somebody else can imitate it, then somebody else can imitate that imitator. So, say Edgar Rice Burroughs is still read, but his imitator Otis Adelbert Klein isn't read, and Lynn Carter imitating Burroughs isn't read, because the next time they need Burroughs imitators, somebody else is going to do it, very likely Will Murray. Basically, the imitators can be replaced. The originals cannot. And you see this over and over again, the way that Rider Haggard's She, begat thousands of imitations.
Yeah.
It was a whole genre, publishing. They didn't put labels and spines in those days, but, Lost World novels were a whole genre of publishing as distinct as science fiction. And they're all gone. Like there are about 5 or 6 Gothic novels that anybody reads. And I don't know how many imitations of Dracula there are, but they're all gone. And the originals are still there because they provide that special something. So Wolfe, we suggest, provides that special something.
Yeah. Okay. But do you remember anything else from that interview that stood out or that surprised you?
Well, you should. Otherwise, you should rush out and get a copy of Speaking of the Fantastic 2 by Darrell Schweitzer. It's available from Wildside Press or directly from me on eBay.
Oh, we'll put links up. Don't worry. We will absolutely have links.
Anyway, I don't know. I don't remember where we were when we did this. So I don't actually remember. I know, just looking through it, I have it right in front of me. We're getting sort of very erudite and classical. And he's rather pleased with me that I recognize that the Commonwealth is based on Byzantium, not medieval Europe. And that occurred to me because the Commonwealth is clearly in decline, but it's such a slow decline. As Gene pointed out, your great-grandchildren will still be living in it. If you were living in Byzantium and in, say, the year 900, you would recognize that things are kind of winding that maybe, but your great-great-grandchildren are still going to be living in Byzantium.
Yeah.
It's not going to be upset quickly. Well, Gene was he was of course vastly learned about history and religion and mythology. one thing that impressed me was that when he said that he actually had somebody, he took lessons in classical Greek in order to write the Latro books.
Mm.
He wanted to know how they thought, and therefore he learned classical Greek. He wanted to, for example, he discovered they didn't really have the same concept of time that we do, and he was writing about a time when the sundial was a new thing. And therefore, they didn't think in terms of hours, or certainly not in minutes. It was sort of like breakfast time and midday and that kind of stuff. So he wanted to get the sort of rhythms of that. Well, that's, what can I say? That's integrity. This is why sometimes you couldn't tell if Gene was playing head games with you. The one that actually did startle me once. I don't remember in what context it came up, but I mentioned the donation of Constantine. And he professed to have never heard of it and not know what that is. Now, the donation of Constantine was a famous medieval forgery that started, according to legend, Constantine had leprosy and the Pope cured him, and therefore he donated central Italy to the Pope. This is not true, but it took till about 1500 before anybody figured out this document was a fake. Now, how could somebody as learned as Gene Wolfe, who also is specialized in Catholic history, not know that? So was he screwing with me? Had he sort of subtly taken offense that I had mentioned it? I don't know. In reality, the donation of Pepin was quite real. Basically, was it Charlemagne's father or grandfather, I forget which, gave the Pope central Italy, but Constantine wasn't giving away anything.
We've often wondered about that because Joan Gordon, who wrote a book on Wolfe a while back and has done some other criticism, but she talks about him as a kind of autodidact, that he was very well learned in very particular sort of slices of sections, but it didn't necessarily follow the kind of that you might think of about like an academic, of getting the whole spread of everything that might come with something. And so that it did seem like there were certain areas where he was incredibly focused, but might not have just had a fuller context. And I don't know. Obviously I don't know, but I do like the idea that maybe he was
screwing with me. I think he may have been.
Then other times in some interviews where it does seem like he will definitely play coy about certain things.
Yeah, because that's for Catholic history or medieval Catholic history, that's pretty basic. And he was, he's always citing and naming his characters after obscure saints.
Yeah.
I'm not, but what was it, that Michael Andre, what's his name? Drusius, yeah. I was never sure how to pronounce that. He has, published these, this sort of this reference, Gene Wolfe reference book.
Mm-hmm.
You know the one I mean?
Yep. Lexicon Earthus.
Yeah, and it's full of all these citations of various saints, this and that. So if there's somebody named Thecla in one of the there is somebody named Thecla in the
mm-hmm.
Yeah, but which Thecla are we talking about? There are a couple of saints by that name, and there are a couple of sisters of Byzantine empresses, and I think the general rule for Wolfe is that he's a little more focused on antiquity than the later Middle Ages.
I think that's right, and not just the Latro books, but it does seem like what the kinds of references he makes definitely prefer things that are much more on the classical end.
Yeah, like for example, there's one case where I know that I'm actually cited in Lexicon Earthus where for the name Hormisdas, which I commented was a Persian name, and the famous Hormisdas was the pretender that Julian the Apostate tried to put on the throne. And all it said is Gene Wolfe hasn't commented on this. I bet you I got the wrong Hormisdas, because probably the one he has in mind came out of Herodotus.
Mm.
Whereas, this is Julian the Apostate is 4th century AD. And as somebody who's mentioned in, Ammianus Marcellinus. And I don't think that was the period that Gene was as much interested in. And certainly with his preoccupation with the Latro books, owe a great deal to Herodotus.
Yeah.
And of course, once he'd learned classical Greek, who knows what he read.
Well, I also want to talk about your books, if you don't mind. So we've done our due diligence and talked about Wolfe. But the one thing I wanted to sort of just tell you, I think I told you this in email too, but when people ask for other recommendations of things that are like Wolfe, you're one of the names that often comes up, along with like John Crowley and Lafferty, but particularly your Sekenre books. Am I pronouncing it right? Sekenre?
I think so. Yeah, it turns out the name is misspelled. It's an Egyptian name that was written. It should actually be Sekenre. I left an E out somehow. And originally it was a name that I was once hired by Tor Books to write a Conan novel, which they decided not to publish. And it was set in Stygia, which is Howard's Egypt. Mm-hmm. And there was somebody named Sekenre in there, and I spelled it wrong there too. And I just reused the name. The person in the Conan book is no relation.
And that's where the Sekenre story started, right? Like they were from all the sort of fantastic Egypt that you were talking about. That's where the Sorcerer's world comes from. Is that right?
They're a rebound from a failed Conan book. Really. Here's the story. Well, I wrote an essay about this called "My Career as a Hack Writer." I've never been a very successful hack writer. The two big jobs I ever did that were, in essence, write for hire commission things were both disasters. The DeCamps in the middle 80s commissioned me to write a Conan novel for Tor. And, so I signed and I started writing, and I got the first third of the advance, and then I turned the book in, and I got the second third of the advance, and then Robert Jordan took over as pretty much a series editor, and he asked for revisions, and I made them. And then I mentioned to Catherine, I've made the revisions. And then Catherine DeCamp we're talking about, mm-hmm. And she apparently put in for me to be paid the third of the advance. And then Tor decided not to publish the book. Mm. Well, my conscience is clear. If they really wanted to kill this project, they should have killed it much sooner. They're not getting their money back. And for about every 10 years thereafter, I would mention this to somebody from Tor, and they'd say, I never knew this existed. And then they would ask to see it, and then they would forget about it again. We've been through this cycle several times. But anyway.
They own a book now. Why not put a Conan name on it?
They do own a book. Yeah. They own a book. They could publish it anytime they like. But it was set in Stygia, and with a large sequence in the Stygian underworld, in the land of the dead, all of which is my invention. Howard does not mention any of that. Mm. So with the serial numbers filed off and so on, I mean, both of us can do fake Egypt. And I don't think there were any crocodile-headed persons in it. I haven't read this novel in a long time, actually. But anyway, on the rebound, I proceeded to write the book, which had as little to do with that Conan book as possible, and was probably the book I was really trying to write. Mm-hmm. Because basically my Conan novel was not a very good Robert Jordan pastiche. And they might even have been right not to publish it, because it might not have pleased the audience they had intended. Mm-hmm. When you take all the restraints off, and I don't need a barbarian character, you notice there's a throwaway barbarian in The Mask of the Sorcerer? Uh-huh.
I was going to ask about that one. Yep.
Comes in through the window, for one page, and they just chuck him away. Yep. But I guess that's as close as that book comes to having an in-joke in it. But basically, once all the restraints are off, and I don't have to pretend I'm being Robert E. Howard, and I don't have to write about Conan, then I just let it flow. And I originally, the first four chapters were published in Weird Tales as a novella, mm-hmm. which was a World Fantasy Award finalist. And the difference between the novella version and the novel version is a couple of sentences. There's a couple of sentences were altered just enough to pretend it had some kind of conclusion, so that the magazine appearance wouldn't appear to be it wouldn't look like first installment of a serial.
Gotcha.
And so it's got a very, very slight ending. And then this version was reprinted in the Mammoth Book of Sorcerer's Tales, edited by Mike Ashley, which is one place you can find it. But then I thought I was going to write basically 3 such novellas and do a fix-up book, which would be like about 90,000 words long and so on. But that just didn't work out. I never managed to find the ending of the second novella and just kept going. And the result was a longer book than I thought, and did not have that fix-up tripartite structure after all. So the way you read it now, it almost comes to an end at the end of chapter 4, and then it doesn't.
Yeah, and maybe that explains one reason why. I mean, it's not quite picaresque, but it does have, especially once he goes to the afterworld early on, you get the sense that you're in a place where, you know, we're not just following this through line story. We're in a world where things can come out of the blue after us, and that's part of the wonderful, I feel like, mood of it that I think is probably why a bunch of Wolf fans like it too, is because you start to get a sense of sort of the rules of this world, but the way they come at you is always unexpected.
Well, there is sort of a plot that does conclude it. It's all about Sekenre not becoming a monster. It's basically it's a character story. It's about how does he remain considering he's got like 500 ghosts in his head. How does he not become a monster when most of them are? That's what this is really about. That's how it concludes. But and of course there are sort of random things, like when he meets the exiled queen and her daughter who've been thrown overboard with their luggage and one zombie. Random things do happen like that. But anyway, I mean that's where the rest of the book comes together at that point. I suspect. Well, what I can also say about the Wolf influence, steal from the best. At least it shows you have taste. I think what they're picking up on is that it's that same kind of deeply personal, confessional, first-person narration.
Yeah.
Only probably my narrators are more reliable, except when somebody takes over his head. And there are a couple of points where somebody takes over briefly.
Yeah.
But other than that, it's the same kind of narrative as Wolfe would use, only a lot easier and a lot simpler. And certainly, I'm no linguist, so probably linguistically it's a lot simpler.
I feel like we also know what Sekenre is going through a little bit more than sometimes I think people know what Severian's going through.
Well, Severian is also, as people point out, Severian has an agenda sometimes, or he doesn't want to tell you the truth.
Yeah.
Now, have you read the second Sekenre book?
Yes.
Okay. Well, it's there. The reason all those stories are in the third person is that I figured that after a couple of thousand years, certainly the last story takes place about 3,000 years after the others. Is that Sekenre's mind would be too weird, and I could not really realistically. I basically in the Mask of the Sorcerer, he really is still a kid. These things are happening to him, but he chronologically has not lived very long. But after he has lived a couple thousand years of this, his mind would probably be too weird, and I would not be able to reproduce the way he thinks. Therefore, all of the later stories are about people who met him.
Great way to do it, too.
And it's an excellent piece of evasion, to sidestep the core problem where you can't do it. Think of say Tom Dish's Camp Concentration, where the character is not only a genius but goes insane, and he's got to write this as a diary. I'm not sure he brought it up. He probably got as close as anybody can to writing the diary of a mad genius, but maybe I wasn't that ambitious. And also, what is easy? Well, I'm probably a little too addicted to first person, but what is, for me at least, is a very easy mode of narration is basically an adult viewpoint looking back on childhood, with the story being the story in essence being, this is how I became who I am. And I've written rather a lot of those, and to some extent you have to actually sort of stop and not write one that is like your previous one. There's not, if you're a prolific short story writer, this is an actual problem. When you assemble collections, you discover you have two stories in them that have exactly the same structure or something. I have temporarily sworn off the old school chum story. You have probably read some of those.
I think I'm looking at Mysteries of the Faceless King and think I may read.
There are some in there, like, for instance, particularly one of the Secret Masters. Is that in there? I don't remember. But basically, it's the story about somebody when they were younger fell under the influence, usually in college, fell under the influence of a much stronger personality. who then proceeded to show them something very weird. Mm-hmm. Then they went back to normal life and tried to be normal. And then the other person came back. The old school chum came back and reinserted the weirdness into the protagonist's life. This is a perfectly valid plot and thematic structure, as long as you don't do it too often.
It seems like it has Lovecraftian kinds of things, but Lovecraft's usually, I guess he's usually more doing the weirdness has now taken over, and this is my last will and testament. But
yeah. Well, Lovecraft didn't actually regard characters very important.
Yeah.
It's sort of an aesthetic statement with him. It wasn't that he couldn't characterize, because in something like the case of Charles Dexter Ward, you see he certainly can. Mm-hmm. But he did not regard individuals and their personal relationships as to be very important. Of course, you can generate a good deal of plot and interest that way. Yes, I'm left thinking if Guillermo del Toro ever successfully gets his movie of At the Mountains of Madness made, he's going to have to add some plot.
Yeah, yep, and character.
Otherwise, they're going to spend entirely too much time looking at wall reliefs.
Yeah, and strange hexagonal boxes all over the place.
And he's going to have the characters interact with each other more. Which is why, actually, of Lovecraft stories, this is why I think that the case of Charles Dexter Ward is the most filmable. And I'm still waiting for somebody to do it right.
Well, that makes me want to ask then about Dunsany, because, as I said before, you have written a ton about Dunsany, and I feel some really, I'll say a lot of good insight into sort of how he creates the moods that he does, but he's someone else who didn't necessarily write characters so much. It was more, would you say that he wrote worlds, or he wrote
it depends on which Dunsany you're talking about. Basically he was capable of writing character. You read something like The Curse of the Wise Woman, mm-hmm. and he's fully capable of being a very good relatively conventional novelist. But you're talking about his early short fiction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
these are stuff like The Gods of Bagana, these are almost like lyric poetry. He's writing purely for aesthetic effect and for mood, and he's not really creating worlds in the detailed, sort of almost pedantic way that Tolkien does. The detail isn't there. He's just creating them as flights of fancy, which is why he's so difficult to imitate.
Although I will say, one of the reasons why I appreciate you as a writer is I feel like there are some stories you've done that are the closest to Dunsany imitation that I've ever seen, and I mean that as a compliment. But
it might be that. Well, I certainly have learned a great deal from. Again, steal from the best, you have taste. Mm-hmm. But don't just do that.
Right.
The thing is, I have more interest when I'm writing that kind of story. I have much more interest in character than he does. Look at a story like The Mysteries of the Faceless King, for example. That has elements of you could say are Dunsanian, but it also has quite a lot of elements that aren't. Basically, once you have absorbed an influence, you start using it for your own purposes. Or something like The Sorcerer of Aragdu is another good example.
The one I'm thinking of is, it's The King's Wager, and I've forgotten the king's name.
King of Orion's Wager.
There you go. Yeah. That one in particular, to me, I remember when I read it, immediately felt like I finally read somebody who could capture what's fascinating about Dunsany.
And also knows how to steal from Borges.
Yeah. That's probably why I liked it too. So how did you get to write so much? Would you call it criticism? I mean, your Dunsany book is, it's nonfiction. It's not necessarily reviews. It's sort of like it's
a critical survey. It's frankly pretty shallow. I've been of the concerted opinion that one should not do this under the age of 30, but I did. But fortunately, this book can, you realize I also wrote books at about the same age. I wrote books about Robert E. Howard and H.P. Lovecraft, mm-hmm. for Borgo Press, and neither of these is very good. The Dunsany one still has some virtue, largely because it entailed original research. You can sort of ignore some of the shallow opinions in it, but there's some real research in there. this is the first attempt by anybody to survey the entire territory. So it's just like I'm the first explorer they sent to an island, and I took some photos, and they weren't very good photos, but they're the first ones we've got. Well, S.G. Joshi's book about Dunsany, I would point out, I think it is more profound than mine, and better researched and more scholarly, but it's also hideously expensive. So, shameless plug, mine is at least cheaper.
Yeah.
I've still got boxes of them, because George Sithers never really sold very many copies of that book. He was getting old and sort of slowing down and not doing as much promotion as he used to, and also getting behind in his bookkeeping, I'll admit. So I actually, frankly, never received royalties on that book.
Oh no! Well,
but I ended up in possession of the entire print run. So yeah, I got paid, but I'm going to probably be selling it for the rest of my life and then some. I'll line my tomb with them.
Well, let's see if we can help you. I know we got people who follow us who are big into Dunsany, so maybe we can get.
Yeah, look it up on eBay if nothing else. It's I have it listed there. $10 a copy.
Well, you mentioned Joshi too. You wrote a book with him on Lovecraft. Is that right?
Well, no, he and I compiled a bibliography.
Oh, okay.
Of Dunsany, and it's been through 2 editions from Scarecrow Press, and also of late, Martin Anderson has been involved with some of the notes. But basically, what happened was that I had been interested in Dunsany since I was in college, and had used what I could at the college library to go through periodicals and find stray Dunsany. That is also how the book The Ghost of the Heaviside Layer happened. Are you familiar with that?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Well, there was one point which I naively thought I had found all of his uncollected stories. But you'll notice that in the introduction, I very carefully left the door open for there might be a couple more. And then it turns out there are like 150 more. But of course, Joshi and the Swedish scholar Martin Anderson have been to Dunsany Castle and have been through all the papers, and they found vast amounts of more stuff. But basically, my position as a Dunsany scholar, quote unquote, is that I'm the person who scratched the surface. So basically, what we did is by the time I was done, I had a series of notes, and I had that little table in the back of known performances of the plays, which I compiled largely by cribbing it out of Mark Amory's biography of Dunsany. So Joshi and I built on that. One time, the two of us, he stayed over at my house once. This must have been, longer ago than I care to admit. Well, it was back in the old days when you could walk into a college library and they let you into the stacks. We went into the library, I guess it must have been the early 80s, or somewhere around then. Anyways, I think sometime in the 1980s, S.T. Joshi and I went into the library of the University of Pennsylvania, which has a magnificent periodical section. And says, the way they run the libraries nowadays, you'd have to ask for each volume, they'd bring it to you. We had no idea what we were looking for. Fortunately, we were allowed to roam in the periodical stacks. And so we would just pull down a bound volume of a magazine saying, oh, look, this looks promising. Queen's Quarterly, what's that? And it turns out to be a British magazine from the early 50s, and it had 5 or 6 Dunsany items in it.
That's great. Yeah.
And we went through and Xeroxed like crazy and found all sorts of stuff that way. And so before you know it, well, Joshi is much more the scholar than I am, but again, I started it. And I continued to keep notes about stray anthologization appearances and so on. I don't know if there'll ever be a 3rd edition. There can be a supplemental pamphlet someday of all the stuff that isn't in the 2nd edition.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, that's essential work, because Dunsany is hard to find. All those pieces before you did that work.
Well, the real breakthrough was when Joshi, I have to admit, Joshi did about 3/4 of the work. He got a key to all of the anonymous stuff in Punch.
Oh.
And that opened up a lot. We suddenly, stories like Rewarding the Fairies and so on were now identified for the first time. The ones I had found had his name on them. And I mostly found them by looking through old magazines. And when I was a kid, my family went to Maine every summer, and we spent a good deal of time in used bookstores. And so I sort of grew up with old periodicals.
Yeah.
and was always knew. I really, I was the kind of person who would find something in a 1919 issue of Atlantic or something, and I would keep those. So that was how I gradually built up this collection of stray Dunsany. Like there's one story in Smart Set, which I found in the Smart Set anthology, not in the magazine itself. But anyway, Joshi really blew it open when he got the key to the contents of Punch magazine, and that found a lot. At that point, by the time he did that, I was editing Weird Tales, and you'll notice that Dunsany became a prolific writer for Weird Tales for a while there. In fact, one time he had 6 stories in one issue. And the reason for that was that our publication schedule had become sufficiently erratic that we were in danger that our license for those stories was going to run out. So they're all very short stories. So I just crammed them all into one issue.
That's great that we have them now.
Yeah, well, it's great. Yeah, it's great that we have them. And the further result was that Joshi did a book for Hippocampus Press called the Ghost in the Corridor, which is an entire volume of uncollected Dunsany material. It seems that Dunsany was going to, this is something he must have discovered by going through the files at the castle. Dunsany had in 1956 assembled another collection. It was never sent out to publishers. And he got the contents of that plus other stories and put it together as a book for Hippocampus. And of course, it all dates back to when I was a kid, maybe in high school, maybe about the 9th or 10th grade. I found a copy of A Dreamer's Tales in a local thrift shop for a dime, the Sidney Syme illustrated edition for a dime. It was actually relative. These books were not rare in those days, and I had to borrow a dime from my brother. But but having spent a great deal of time in used bookstores, I rapidly found most of the other stuff.
The one other book that I know people mention a lot of yours, especially in relation to Wolfe, is the Shattered Goddess and the Goddess stories.
Yeah.
I know I've read the one book, The Shattered Goddess, but there are other stories too, I think.
There is a book called Echoes of the Goddess. There we go. Yeah, all of which take place before the Shattered Goddess. It's a Wildside Press book. Trade paperback only, has a recycled Stephen Fabian cover. And it contains all of the other stories, which were published, all of which were written after The Shattered Goddess, but which, I think that, no, one of them was written before, but then the others were all written after. And most of them were published in the early 80s. One was even serialized, and is a novella, and was serialized in a now completely forgotten magazine called Fantasy Book in the middle 80s.
That's the Goddess stories, though. I think more Wolfe fans won't know as much about it because it doesn't have Wolfe's blurb like the Mask of the Sorcerer still does.
Yeah, it's well, they were written before I'd read very much Wolfe, and they were written before Wolfe was seriously famous. Actually, well, he became famous about 1982. So I guess they do coincide. They came out about the same time as the Book of the New Sun did, but the influence is really not there.
Right.
Except maybe in the rewrites a little bit, because I frankly rewrote some of this material for the book. And the book was originally supposed to be published by the Donning Company in the 80s, and then it wasn't, and due to various delays, it wasn't published for, well, I'd have to look up when the date is, at least another 25 years. And it was because it was only published because for a brief period I actually had on the combination of stuff I had on my computer, I had reliable OCR scanning, so I could scan all the stories and then rewrote some of them anyway. But because the stories were written up to about 1985 or 86, they predate my having a personal computer. Yes, I will mention that in 1976 I wrote a science fiction story in which people 100 years in the future are using typewriters.
You weren't alone in that, I don't think. I think loads of people were doing.
Can you remember the period in which whenever somebody brought a computer to a convention, it was this great marvel, and the crowd would gather around, and the very top pro writers like Silverberg and Pornell would get off in the corner and talk about their computers, and nobody else knew what they were talking about?
I remember game cons that I go to when I was younger, where the people who had the very earliest laptops were, and you could play chess on it or something like that. And Yeah.
Well, I can remember. Well, basically, just a portable Macintosh. I can remember Somtau Sukaritko was very proud of the fact that he'd gotten a very early Macintosh. He'd been managed to cross-program various things in a music program, and he managed to make his computer fart. It was apparently something of an accomplishment. But yeah, when I was in college, no one ever imagined that, well, at least I didn't, that there would be personal computers. That individuals would actually own these. Now, a computer was something you took a box of punch cards, and you sort of handed it over the counter to the high priest, who took it off and did mysterious things with it, and came back with your results. And the computer was the size of a refrigerator, at least.
Yeah, that's what my dad actually did. That he was a computer programmer back when the computer would be an entire floor of a building, and he was the punch card guy. Yeah,
it could be the entire building. I once heard Jerry Pournelle describe, when he was young, he hitchhiked across the country to see the I think what would have been the ENIAC 1, the big computer at the University at University of Pennsylvania. We're probably talking about like 1948. And he said it was the size of a barn, and it covered the whole inside of a building, and there were walkways all the way up the walls, and graduate students pushing shopping carts full of light bulbs, because it had millions of light bulbs, and therefore at any given time some of those light bulbs were burning out. So these guys were just walking around on these catwalks, endlessly changing bulbs.
High tech at its finest.
Yes, that computer probably had less computing power than your watch.
Oh yeah. No, I mean, I still remember learning to program on an Apple IIc when I was younger, and now been thinking that giant heavy beast was. Hey,
I had the first thing I had was a Franklin 1200, which is an Apple II Plus clone. Had 64K of memory. But once you got a computer that could handle a book-length manuscript, you had a modern word processor.
Yep, I remember one of the first times I figured out how to get one running, because the first word processor I had would only save single pages at a time. Each file was its own page, and then when we upgraded to another one,
you usually put a link command at the bottom.
I think that's probably what it was. I don't remember, but yeah.
Well, basically, as soon as I graduated about 1985, graduated to the Apple GS. Once my various friends of mine souped it up, we actually had as much as 4 megs of memory. Wow. And the 4 megs of memory was enough you could handle. It all went on the desktop because the computer didn't need them. It was actually designed to run on like 120K, and you had just thrown 4 megs at it. So it had an enormous desktop, and it was well programmed enough that it would just, if you add more memory, it would just take it and use it. You could handle a novel length manuscript on that.
That's great.
And of course, if you tried to run the spell check, you'd probably crash it. But hey, there was a time when any professional writer could get all the equipment they needed for about $5 in a thrift shop. You would go buy a used typewriter, a used manual. You don't buy electrics because the motors are going to give out. Get yourself a good, solid used manual, and you'd spend about a half an hour checking every possible function because it was not possible to repair it. And then you could use it because, basically taking it to a shop to have something repaired was not worth it. If it broke, you chuck it out and you go to your church rummage sale and you buy another one. And so you could buy a perfectly good typewriter for about $5. And really, that was all you needed. And then the great technological boon was the photocopier.
And suddenly, manuscripts survive. Yeah.
Well, at that point, the subject or the object of producing a manuscript was to produce something which could be photocopied. Not necessarily something to be submitted directly. You submitted the photocopy, and therefore, literal cut and paste with a pair of scissors was quite possible.
Yeah.
And you could make a correction by pasting something over, a word, and wouldn't have to retype everything, just Xerox the result. Copiers are more sensitive, I remember George Sithers had a copier where you could adjust the density very, very slightly by sliding a little bar. It's much more sensitive than a modern copier, which have digital adjustments for the density. Mm-hmm. And you could do hairline adjustments, and so you'd push it right down to the point where the cut lines disappear.
Yeah.
And you could produce a very clean manuscript.
This makes me think of Chip Delaney told a story not too long ago, and I knew he'd always talked about having lost a couple manuscripts, but yeah, just thinking about the need for copiers and how much making a copy can affect somebody's life.
You realize how much DeCamp made the comment that the invention of the copier made the anthologist job vastly easier. Mm-hmm. You know how you put together an anthology in 1950? This is pretty horrifying.
Physically find the journals.
What you actually had to do is you had to find 2 copies of the aforesaid journal, and you had to be ready to destroy them. Because what you had to do, what they wanted you to do, they wanted you to cut out the page and paste it on a piece of like you get, the pulp magazine or something.
Yeah.
You cut out the pages and you paste them on sheets of typing paper so that there'd be room around the edges for copy editing and so on, which of course means you need 2 copies because you're pasting one page down and then the verso of that on the next one and so on. Well, yeah, sure, I'm going to cut up 2 copies of the first issue of Weird Tales. It was expensive even then. The photocopier made life much easier. Your other alternative was you'd have to retype it. Anyway, we're probably well off the subject of Gene Wolfe by now.
Are any other anecdotes about Wolfe that, I'm sure you ran into him at cons many times.
I ran into him at cons many times. I remember he was generally, just very friendly and accessible. I was told he had a temper and could be difficult, but I never saw that. Mm-hmm. He was always very, very friendly and accessible to me. I know he admired the To Become a Sorcerer, the short version of Mask of the Sorcerer, which he described as, quote, one hell of a story, unquote. And he felt it should be published by Tor. I understand that David Hartwell wanted to publish it from Tor, but it was apparently overruled. Mm. And David made the most extraordinary offer to me, which was that he offered to publish it by himself as a Dragon Press book. Remember he had published Philip K. Dick's Confessions of a Crap Artist that way. Mm-hmm. And he published a couple books by Delaney. But he actually offered to publish The Mask of the Sorcerer as a Dragon Press book. But then at that point, the book club, the American Book Club had acquired the rights to do the British paperback. Uh-huh. Remember this began life as a British paperback. But as soon as the American Book Club had it, David, of course, withdrew his offer quite sensibly because the book club was going to just plaster it all over the place. Yeah. Well, they didn't really plaster it all over the place, but I can tell you they sold out.
That's good.
I don't know how many they printed, but they called me up one day and said, we're about to remainder of The Shattered Goddess. How many do you want? And I asked them how many they got. And they said they had 1,500.
Oh, wow.
Well, that's too much. And they were offering them to me at $1.50 a copy. I took 500. I don't know what happened to the others. But I asked them if they had any Mask of the Sorcerer, and they said no, it had sold out. But that was about the book club never came back to me for anything else, and it was just as well that when many crates showed up at my house, my wife wasn't home, so I could smuggle them into the garage without smothering us. Well, I bought a Gene Wolfe story once. George Sithers always made a tradition. Every time he started a new magazine, he'd buy a Gene Wolfe story. So. I think the last story he bought for Asimov was a Gene Wolfe story. The first story he bought for Amazing was a Gene Wolfe story. And the first stories we bought for Weird Tales were Gene Wolfe stories. But I got to buy a Gene Wolfe story for the title of which you will have to look up to make it sound articulate. It's the one that's in Full Moon City, the urban werewolf anthology.
My buddy actually remembers where everything is published. He's got a much better...
It's about a guy in a confessional who you think is a child molester, and he's confessing to being a werewolf. Anyway, so I bought that. But we nearly lost it because the idiot publishers wanted to censor it.
Really? The child abuse part?
Basically the line, no, I didn't touch her there. Now, frankly, I was on Wolfe's side. And the publisher in general I think was pretty clueless. Well, to give you an idea, there's a story of mine in that volume called Kvetula's Daughter, which is about, a family of vampires who meet a werewolf. So it was an urban werewolf story. But at one point, they've got a minion who is, hunchbacked and drooling and eating bugs and so on. And they're saying, he's just like that nice Mr. Renfield we met. And the copy editor wrote in the margin, why is this person eating bugs? I don't understand this. In a story with vampires. Come on.
Yeah.
They're really clearly not qualified. And what only had to happen was, first of all, Marty Greenberg saved the day. Because Marty Greenberg was an 800-pound gorilla that could tell them, if you screw this up, we'll just take the book elsewhere. They wanted to rewrite Peter Beagle, too, and whereas I didn't have that kind of clout, I couldn't have done that. But Marty saved the day, which is one reason why we actually share the byline on that one, even if I was the one who actually bought the stories. But anyway.
Innocent was the name of the story, by the way.
Innocent, yeah. Needless to say, we did not allow them to cut a line out of the Gene Wolfe story. And John Helfers, Marty's assistant, and I divided the book up between us and had to proofread it. And then we got a decent text in print, but we had to pretty much undo what the various idiots had done, and thus saved the Gene Wolfe. So yeah, basically, Gene certainly had a sense of integrity. He would not have allowed somebody to mess with his text like that, and I can only sympathize.
I've asked other people who've edited the Wolfe before, and one thing I always want to know is, did you fully understand the story when you bought it?
That one, yes. Oh, certainly. That was not difficult. I think he even made a comment in a letter somewhere. Well, Darryl probably won't understand this.
Because I think Swanwick said one time that he had talked to Dessois about the gardener Dessois about it, and he was like, "No, we if Wolfe offers it to us, we print it."
Well, that's a very difficult editorial decision.
Yeah.
I've been in that position. Sometimes you have to take a leap of faith.
Mm-hmm.
You have to basically take the leap that you don't quite understand this, but your readers will.
Mm.
The other writer you have to do that with is Thomas Ligotti.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah.
And usually you're right to do it. To basically take that leap of faith. There's another deep, dark secret I can tell you about magazine editing, which enables you to do this, which is that you can get away with anything in 10 pages. Yeah, if it's short and the readers don't like it, it isn't really going to do much damage.
They'll forgive you.
It's just, well, what you do, and this is something actually I frankly learned from Farnsworth Wright, who was always hesitant about, he was always afraid that, I think he was much too timid actually, but he was always afraid that his readers weren't going to understand the more artistic stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe he was right that they wouldn't. But what he would always do is what you do in a case like that is you front load the issue with a Seabury Quinn story or an Otis Adelbert Klein's or something, easy, accessible, and trashy that is going to be popular. And then you have the difficult artistic story, you still put that in the back somewhere. And if it's only like 10 pages long, you will get away with it. And they will still like the magazine and come back and buy more, whether they like that story or not. It's just if you had a novella that dominated the whole issue and most people didn't understand it, that'd be another issue, another matter entirely.
And then years later, people will come looking for that one for the artistic.
They would, but basically, certainly, any experience I ever had with buying Gene Wolfe stories, they were always quite short. And usually, most of his stories are I admit there are some that I don't understand.
Oh, there are plenty I don't understand.
Yeah, the long one that I don't understand to this day is Alien Stones.
Mm-hmm.
I've never been able to make sense out of that one. But and there are some shorter ones that I don't really get, like the Solar Labyrinth, which Gene seemed to be very proud of, but I don't really get that one. But most of his short stories are very lucid. This is one reason that other writers admire him so much, because the level of craft there is more than most of us can achieve. This comes back to why if you steal from Gene Wolfe or somebody like that, and the result is only half as good as him, it's still something of an accomplishment. It's probably better than anything else you've ever done.
what's something else that you might lead people towards of yours? Anything new or recent? Or
Well, the most recent thing is that 2-volume set of the career retrospective, Mystery of the Faceless King and The Last Heretic. Although one of the stories in there was actually written 50 years ago, which makes me feel old. And other recent collection that I would point people to is Awaiting Strange Gods, which are mostly folksy Lovecraftian stories without any attempt to imitate Lovecraft. I'm basically doing with him what I did with Dunsany, which is once I've absorbed the influence, starting to write my own stories in them. And there is another such volume going to come out from Hippocampus Press, probably in about March of 23.
Does it have a title yet?
Yes, it's called The Children of Chorazin, Chorazin. Chorazin. Well, if you're an M.R. James fan, you know this name. Remember, it's where Count Magnus took the Black Pilgrimage.
Oh, yeah, I do remember that story.
Basically, the original Chorazin is in the Middle East, and it's supposedly where the Antichrist will be born. My Chorazin is in upstate Pennsylvania.
A mid-Atlantic.
Yeah, mid-Atlantic Antichrist. Well, no, it's basically it's in that blank part of the map on Pennsylvania. You go up to the Poconos, up a little past Scranton, turn left, and there's nothing there. That's where the town's full of strange cult worshippers are and that kind of stuff. That's where we hide them. I'll mention that in the next issue of Penumbra magazine, which is a journal that comes out from Hippocampus Press, edited by S.T. Joshi, I set a record in that I have a story, an essay, and a poem all in the same issue.
Wonderful.
First person
is it
to
the
do
Schweitzer issue? Is that what it should
No,
be
not particularly, but I do have a short story which is also about rural Pennsylvania weirdness and imaginary parts of Pennsylvania. And the article is about a woman named Violet Sturgis Crosby, who was a budding writer who died at the age of 19, but it so happened that she corresponded with Lord Dunsany. 20 years after her death, her family published a book of her work, which has like 30 pages of many pages of Dunsany correspondence in it. And so I wrote an article about this, largely to tell the world what this is and what I found. It's a short article, but it's the kind of thing that will make excellent fodder for my next essay collection. I would say about these kind of articles, I'm not really a scholar, I'm more of a popularizer, but that's a good thing to be. I think my stylistic model for this kind of writing is Michael Dirda. You know his work?
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's infected by scholarship.
He writes wonderful books about books.
Yeah. Yeah.
He's a columnist for the Washington Post. He writes wonderful books about books, things like Bound to Please and Classics for Pleasure and that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. That's good. I wish we had more people like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I wish we had. He's an appreciator. What he really is an appreciator. He describes, he explores books and explains why you should read them. And I try to do that. I don't have the let's say S.T. Joshi can do a profound analysis on the basis of philosophy that he's formally trained in. Well, I'm not formally trained in it, so I just report back on what I've read. Okay, Michael Dirda was very amused when I told him that his books made excellent bathroom reading, because they do.
Yeah, no, I totally know.
You open them at random, read a short essay or two, and
exactly. So as I said, I've always liked your fiction, but I've probably just because my day job is more on that scholarly side, I've always enjoyed your nonfiction and your writing about writing, just because it's just like I said, insightful about people I love. So,
well, I appreciate your appreciation.
Well, good. Well, then, Darryl, thank you so much for your time and for the stories, and I appreciate it. And I'm definitely going to be encouraging people to go buy your copies of Pathways to Elfland and your other fiction, especially the Sorcerer book.
Just about everything of mine that's worth reading is in print. I've had a very unusual career in that way. It just sort of a very low boil. Like We're All Legends has been in print. It was published in 1981, and it's still in print.
That's great, though. I mean,
Yeah, and the Shattered Goddess is actually in print from Wildside Press, although I'm selling used book club editions. And if I ever run out of those, I have a box of the British paperback. I ended up getting a little overinvested in that one.
Well, that's great. Well, I'll definitely send links to put links to your eBay up there, and then if people want something, I'll get in touch with you. So that way, Amazon doesn't have to get its cut. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, you're welcome.
I can see we're thinking about the same things. I can see your expression when the phone rings. We both know there's something happening here. Well, there's no use in dancing around the subject of who gets worse when it's treated with neglect. Well, don't turn around, there's nothing here to fear. You can talk to me. Talk to me. You can talk to me. You can set your secrets free, baby. Dusty words lying under carpets, seldom heard. Well, must you keep your secrets locked inside, hidden, safe from view? Was it all that hard? Is it all that tough? Well, I've shown you my cards. Isn't that enough? You can hide your hurt, but there's nothing you can do. You can talk to me. Talk to me. Talk to me. You can set your secrets free, baby. You can talk to me. You can talk to me. Talk to me. You can talk to me.
Edited and cleaned up so I can make us sound better and all that kind of thing afterwards. So
You might be able to make us articulate. Chip Delaney has a wonderful line about, well, he said editing transcripts of your speech is the only time you ever get in life to be truly articulate.
I like that. Yeah. And that's absolutely what we
Somebody better get that.
don't worry. This is also, like I said, the beauty of this stuff is editing. We can
There
always
was
be
a
wrong.
time.
She's one I tried after I read Michael Swanwick's little biography of her, and I did try to read a couple of the other novels of hers, and they were fine, but there's something about it, I don't know, it's my genre geekness or whatever, but
Whatever. London the Mist is, she's like Bram Stoker. She may have written in other books, but she's a one-book author.
yeah. Swanwick made a big deal of her poem, of the one long
Yeah, he did.
modernist poem. He said it rivaled Eliot's Wasteland. And
I'm not totally convinced of that myself, but
yeah,
oh well.
I've been curious, but I didn't finish the poem, so I can't pass
Well,
judgment yet.
one wonders what would have happened if H.P. Lovecraft had ever read it. Have you ever read Lovecraft's parody of the Wasteland?
Yes, actually, I did a whole. There's a different podcast I do, but I did a whole episode on his Christmas poetry of all things.
Oh my!
And read a bunch of stuff about. Read that in the process.
Yeah,
a bunch of his poetry. Yeah, it was actually quite good, quite funny. I thought so.
It's very funny. Very funny. He was actually a very funny guy, but that's another subject.
Oh shoot! What's the more the genre that is just sort of like random adventures or one after the other, which is a word I've used. Thank you, picaresque.
Picaresque.